Hi, welcome to lesson 25 of Chef's Apprentice, learning to cook like a pro, one small plate at a time. This is the roasted pork tenderloin master recipe. This is a reliable recipe for making tender, juicy pork tenderloin, cooked to medium doneness, and we'll talk more about that later. Techniques used today are chopping, trimming a pork tenderloin, brining, seasoning, marinating or glazing, searing, roasting, finishing in the oven, resting, and slicing. So let's start cooking. So we're going to start with our meats, and of course the main ingredient is the pork tenderloin, which we have here. This is a great cut of pork for slicing and portioning. You can do a lot of different things with it, and it's very flavorful if it's not overcooked. We're going to cook it to medium, which is an internal temperature of about 135 degrees Fahrenheit. It might be slightly pink. Now, a lot of people fear undercooked pork. That is really a remnant of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And if you overcook pork, it is basically flavorless, because I should say if you overcook pork tenderloin, it's basically flavorless because it has virtually no fat in it. That's why it's a tenderloin. Now, this recipe, as I mentioned in the introduction, is reliable, but I should warn you that sometimes kitchen gremlins get in the way. I've had situations where I've used this recipe probably 200 times, works almost every time, but every now and then there's a piece of pork tenderloin that just doesn't want to cook, and so you will face that from time to time. Now, I'll tell you, if you get these pork tenderloins in a vacuum-sealed cryovac bag, when you open the bag, you might get kind of a nasty smell. You might be tempted to think that the pork is bad, but that's actually a gas, or the effect of a gas that they use in the cryovac treatment. So you don't have to worry about that. The smell will clear. We're also going to need some extra virgin olive oil. Now, I always use extra virgin olive oil, but I don't pay a lot of money for it because I don't use it a lot for finishing. I use it mostly for cooking. And the great taste that you get from the really expensive oils, they're best for use at the end when you're finishing something, and you lose a lot of that if you cook it. Also, we'll need kosher salt for seasoning. We're also going to need some more salt for brining. We'll need our peppermill as usual. Some Dijon mustard, and we're going to need some white wine. Now, white wine's very common today, but when Julia Child first started teaching cooking in the United States, white wine was actually not very common. So she taught people to use dry vermouth instead. So I am going to use white wine today because I happen to have a bottle open that I can use the rest of it in this recipe. But if you don't have a bottle open, or you don't want to open a bottle for some reason, dry vermouth is a great substitute. Use the same amount of vermouth that you would have used in white wine. We'll also need some chopped garlic, about 2 tablespoons roughly. I've already chopped it. And also optionally in this particular preparation is some Sriracha chili sauce. And also optional is sugar for the brining. But we are going to do the brining, so I have the sugar here today. For our equipment, we're going to need a boning knife. You could also use a slicing knife. We'll need a bowl for the brining solution, spoon, and then we'll also need a grill or frying pan. We're going to use a frying pan for purposes of searing the pork tenderloin. You'll also need to have a Ziploc bag to do the brining in, and I use this what's it called? It's called a Jokari, Jokari device for holding open the bag. Whoever invented this should get the Nobel Prize for filling Ziploc bags. It's a great little device. It's available on the internet, obviously. Okay, so to start, what we need to do first, according to our prep list, is we have to mix the brining solution. Now, what we want to do that is get about enough warm water or hot water that we can melt the sugar and the salt in it. And so I'm going to go fill the bowl, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back, and I've taken this bowl and I've put about probably about 2 cups of hot water in it. And first we're going to need about a quarter of a cup. Now remember, I've been saying that we're not going to measure things, but really what we're doing here for making this brining solution is we're using 1 part sugar to 1 part salt. So it could be any other measurement. It could be a little glass that you have, for example, but we're going to use 1 part sugar to 1 part salt. In this case, we are going to use a quarter cup of each to about a half a gallon of water. So first we're going to mix these up in warm water or hot water, and then we're going to add cool water so that we have a cool solution for the brining. We don't want to put the pork into a hot water because as long as meat is in the danger zone, which is about 45 degrees to 140 degrees, there is danger of the growth of fast growth of bacteria. So we are going to first mix the brining solution, make sure we have all of the sugar and the salt dissolved, and then we're going to add cold water to this. So I'm going to go do that, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've added water to this bowl, so we have roughly about a half a gallon of brining solution. So that was the first thing on our prep list, mixing the brining solution. Now the reason that we're going to brine this pork tenderloin is that brining helps to tenderize and intensify flavors and make meat juicier. Now, pork tenderloin is already very tender, so we don't really need to tenderize it. But we will intensify the flavor and make it juicier by brining it. Also, when you brine meat and you cut it, you may see that the meat is a little bit pinker than it would have been if you hadn't brined it. And that's especially important to mention when we're cooking pork tenderloin, since I mentioned earlier, some people are afraid of medium pork, but I just wanted to point out that the pork could be slightly pinker because of the brining. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to trim off the fat and silver skin. And you see this here, it's kind of silvery in color. That is silver skin. So we're going to put our boning knife underneath that skin, and we are going to follow it along the pork tenderloin and cut off that silver skin. We're going to try not to cut away any of the meat if we can avoid it. Take that silver skin off there. And I'm going to do this in real time, so you see about how long this takes to do. It doesn't take very long. Now, if there's any excess fat, we want to get that too. There's not much fat on the outside of pork tenderloin. There's no fat inside of a pork tenderloin. We're going to take off the excess on the outside. Any little bits of fat that we find. There's a little bit more membrane and silver skin here, which we're going to trim away. If you don't get all of it, it's not crucial. It's best to get it if you can. The silver skin can be kind of tough to chew. The membrane is not. Just a little bit of fat here on the end. Okay. Good. All right, so it looks like we've cleaned that up pretty well. I'm going to leave this little bit of fat that's down here in this flap. A little bit more here on this end. Okay. Now, we've trimmed our pork tenderloin, and now we're going to brine it. Now, to brine it, you simply put it into the bag, and then we're going to pour in. So I put it into the bag here. Let's move this out of the way. Put the pork down into the bag using this little device. Now, of course, you don't have to have this device, but it does make it easier. And then we're going to pour in brining solution to cover the pork. Good. Okay. Now, I have pork hands, so I've been trying to be careful not to contaminate anything with my pork hand. And what we're going to do, well, I'm not going to be able to avoid that. Just wipe off my hand here. What we're going to do is seal the bag, and then we're going to put it into a pan. Try to get as much air out of the bag as we can. Now, having air in the bag is not bad for purposes of brining, but it just can make it hard for the brine to get totally covering the pork. We're going to put it in the bag like that. Then we're going to put it into the refrigerator. Now, ideally, we're going to do it overnight, but this is early morning, so I'm going to put it in for the rest of the day, and we will cook it this evening. So here we are back at the board. The pork tenderloin has been brining in the refrigerator for about 10 hours. I have it right here. The next thing on the prep list was to preheat the oven to 450 degrees, and I've done that. And the next thing on the prep list was to bring the pork to room temperature. Now, I brought this out about a half an hour ago. We want to take it out of the brining solution. So I don't contaminate my hands, I'm going to use a pair of tongs. And now we want to pat this dry. We want to just dry it off a bit. Now, the reason you want to bring it to room temperature, and this is true of any protein, and when I say protein, I mean any kind of beef, any kind of pork, any kind of poultry, seafood, bring it all to room temperature before you cook it for several reasons. One is that it relaxes the protein before you start to cook it. Two, if you start with a cold meat, or protein, you're going to be behind the 8 ball from the beginning when you start to try to cook it. So if you want, for example, medium rare on beef, and which means that you want the center to be warm, but the outside is going to be seared. Well, it's going to be hard to get that center to warm temperature if it's just come out of the refrigerator and all you're doing is searing the outside. Now, sorry, we brought this to room temperature, and the next thing on our list is to make the marinade or the glaze. Now, because this is pork tenderloin, we're not going to be marinating it. It's already very tender. So in this case, what we're making is going to be a glaze, which we're going to coat onto the pork tenderloin. So first we need some Dijon mustard. Again, how much? Well, look at the pork tenderloin. You figure out, well, how much do I need to coat that? All we need is a coating on the outside. We're also going to add some white wine. Now, the reason we do this is because if we just simply coated the outside with the Dijon mustard, it gets very pasty, very sticky, and it can burn more easily. So we're going to add a little white wine to it. As I said earlier, you could also use vermouth, dry vermouth, and one advantage of using this over white wine is that it keeps on the shelf forever. And the reason, by the way, that Julia Child recommended it back in the 60s when she started teaching in America was that no one had white wine, but everyone had vermouth for martinis. So that's a little bit of history. Now, we're also going to be adding a little bit of Sriracha. Now, Sriracha is pretty strong, so we don't want to add a lot. Just a couple of dots of it, okay? And then we're going to add in the garlic that we chopped earlier. And we're going to stir this up. Now, you could use more or less Sriracha depending on how spicy you like things. You can see that the Sriracha has given this a bit of a slightly reddish tinge, so it's a decent amount that's in there. It will give a bit of a kick. Right, so we've done that. Now what we want to do is we want to season the pork with kosher salt and pepper on both sides. Now, I usually am fairly generous with the seasoning on the pork tenderloin because it's not getting into the inside; it's only on the outside. So once you slice it, and you're eating the slices, you won't actually taste any seasoning right on the surface of the slice because it's all on the outer edges. And if you're serving a thin slice, then you're not really getting a lot of seasoning. Okay, so now we've done this. We have seasoned the pork tenderloin. Now we're going to put this down into this glaze. Now, you can do this with your hands. I often do it with my hands, but I'm trying to avoid having my hands contaminated at the moment. So I'm using these tongs instead. But you could certainly just use your hands and do it. You could also leave the pork on the board and take a handful of this this glaze and just slather it on there on the board. Okay, so now this has been well slathered with the glaze. It's been seasoned. Now it's time to do a little cooking. Okay, here we are at the stove. We're going to use some olive oil in the pan. There's probably about 2 tablespoons. We're going to put it onto medium-high heat, and we want to get that oil just starting to smoke. Okay, so the oil's just starting to smoke. We're going to put the pork tenderloin down in the pan and let it sear. Okay, it's been about, I'd say 4 minutes, but again, it's going to depend upon your stove, how hot it is, how hot your pan is. So we're going to turn it over, and we're going to sear it on this side for another, say, 4 or 5 minutes till we get about the same amount of brown. Okay, let's check it. It's been about 4 minutes. Oh, look, beautiful on that side as well. Okay, now we're going to put this into the 450-degree oven for 9 minutes. Now, I put it in the pan in which I seared it. You could put it on a sizzle plate if you like. Make sure if you put it in on a pan that you seared it, that the handle of the pan is oven proof. Okay, we'll be back in 9 minutes to check it out. Okay, our timer just went off. It's been 9 minutes. We're going to turn it and let it go another 3 minutes. Okay, our 3-minute timer just went off. Pulled out the pork tenderloin. It looks beautiful. Now we're going to let this rest in a warm place for about 5 to 7 minutes. Okay, we've been resting for about 7 minutes. I see nice clear juices in the pan, so I know that the pork is done. Now we're going to slice it and see. I like to slice on a diagonal. Makes a better presentation. Oh, beautiful. Medium rare. Okay, that's the conclusion of Lesson 25, the pork tenderloin master recipe. You can see photos of the pork from this master recipe being used in a dish on my Instagram, Chef's Apprentice, Cook Like a Pro. Please remember to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.